The night sky over Holland was pitch black when Captain James Mitchell's parachute opened above the sleeping village. It was November 1943, and the war had turned these peaceful Dutch towns into dangerous battlegrounds. James had been dropped here with one simple mission: destroy the German supply depot that was feeding weapons to enemy forces across the region. As his boots hit the muddy ground, James quickly buried his parachute and checked his equipment. His rifle, explosives, and radio were all secure. The village below looked quiet, but he knew better than to trust the silence. German soldiers patrolled these streets every night, and one wrong step could mean capture or death. James made his way carefully through the narrow alleys, staying in the shadows of old brick houses. The smell of smoke hung in the air from recent bombing raids. Broken windows and damaged roofs told the story of a community under attack. These people had been living in fear for 3 long years. Suddenly, the crack of rifle fire split the night air. James dropped to one knee, scanning the darkness for the source. More shots rang out, this time closer. The distinctive sound of German weapons echoed off the stone walls around him. Without warning, he found himself in the middle of a fierce battle. Dutch resistance fighters had launched an attack on a German patrol, and now the entire village was waking up to chaos. James could hear shouting in German as soldiers called for backup. Windows slammed shut as terrified families hid in their homes. The peaceful night had become a war zone in seconds. James moved toward the church at the village center, using doorways and carts for cover. His training kicked in automatically. Stay low, move fast, watch for muzzle flashes. A German soldier appeared around a corner, but James was quicker. The enemy fell silently, never knowing what hit him. The old stone church had been beautiful once, but now half of it lay in ruins from an earlier bombing. Chunks of carved stone and broken stained glass covered the ground. James was about to move past it when he heard something that made him stop, a faint cry for help coming from inside the rubble. Against his better judgment, James climbed over the fallen stones and broken wooden beams. His mission was important, but he couldn't ignore someone in trouble. As he got deeper into the wreckage, the sounds of battle outside seemed to fade away. There, trapped under a heavy wooden beam near what used to be the altar, was a young woman. She looked to be about 25, with dark hair covered in dust and blood on her forehead. Her clothes were torn and dirty, but something about the way she held herself seemed different from the other villagers he had seen. "Please," she whispered. In broken English, "I cannot move." James didn't hesitate. Grabbed the beam and lifted with all his strength, freeing her legs. She tried to stand, but immediately fell back down, clearly hurt. Outside, the gunfire was getting closer, and James knew they had to move quickly. "Can you walk?" he asked, helping her to her feet. She shook her head, wincing in pain. "I think my leg is broken." Without thinking twice, James scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but carrying someone while dodging bullets would not be easy. As they emerged from the church ruins, German voices were shouting orders just one street over. James carried her through the maze of narrow streets, staying away from the main roads where soldiers were searching. The woman in his arms was surprisingly calm, not crying or panicking like most people would. She watched everything around them with sharp, intelligent eyes. "What is your name?" James whispered, as they hid behind an old well while a German patrol passed by. "Wilhelmina," she replied softly, then added something in Dutch that he didn't understand. They moved from shadow to shadow. James's arms burning from carrying her weight, but he never slowed down. A sniper's bullet whistled past his ear, so close he could feel the heat. The woman Wilhelmina tensed in his arms but made no sound. Finally, they reached the edge of the village where James knew a safe house was hidden. It was an old farmhouse that looked abandoned but secretly sheltered Dutch resistance fighters and Allied agents. James kicked the special pattern on the door that would identify him as a friend. An older Dutch man opened the door and quickly let them inside. James gently set Wilhelmina down on a wooden chair, and for the first time, he got a good look at her face, even covered in dirt and blood. There was something remarkable about her. She had the kind of features that belonged in paintings, elegant and refined. "Thank you," she said in perfect English, surprising him with how clear her voice was now that they were safe. You saved my life." James just nodded, already thinking about his mission. The German supply depot still needed to be destroyed, and he had lost valuable time. But as he looked at this mysterious woman who seemed so different from everyone else in the village, he felt glad he had stopped to help the resistance fighters in the safe. House began treating her wounds while James prepared to continue his mission. He had no idea that the woman he had just carried to safety would one day wear a crown and rule a nation. To him, she was just another civilian caught in the chaos of war, someone who needed help, and someone he couldn't leave behind. The safe house was hidden deep in the Dutch countryside, surrounded by tall trees that blocked it from view. It looked like an ordinary farm from the outside, with chickens pecking in the yard and laundry hanging on the line. But inside, it was buzzing with the quiet activity of the resistance movement. James watched as the resistance doctor, an elderly man named Dr. Van Bergen, carefully cleaned Wilhelmina's wounds. Her leg wasn't broken after all, just badly bruised, but she had a nasty cut on her forehead that needed stitches. Through it all, she never complained or cried out in pain. Most people would be shaking after what she had been through, but she remained calm and composed. "You're very brave," James told her as the doctor worked. "Most civilians would be in shock by now." Wilhelmina looked at him with those intelligent dark eyes. "In times like these, we all learn to be braver than we thought possible." She replied in English that was much better than her earlier broken words had suggested. Over the next 3 days, while James planned his mission to destroy the German supply depot, he found himself spending more and more time talking with Wilhelmina. She said she had been a teacher in Amsterdam before the war, and that her family had been killed in a bombing raid 6 months earlier. She was trying to reach relatives in the south when she got caught in the battle, but something about her story didn't quite add up. James had been trained to notice details, and there were things about Wilhelmina that puzzled him. Her hands were soft, not the rough hands of someone who had been doing manual labor to survive. Her teeth were perfect, which was unusual for someone from a poor family during wartime when food was scarce. And the way she held herself, even when sitting in a simple wooden chair, reminded him of the upper-class ladies he had met in London. "Tell me about your teaching," James asked one evening as they sat by the fireplace. The other resistance fighters were planning operations in the next room, their voices low and serious. Wilhelmina's face lit up. "I taught languages to older students: French, German, English, and Italian. I always believed that understanding other cultures makes us more human." She paused, then added, "Before the war, I traveled quite a bit. My family believed education was very important." James raised an eyebrow. Your family must have been well off to afford all that travel?" For just a moment, Wilhelmina looked uncomfortable. "My father worked for the government," she said quickly. "We were comfortable, but not wealthy." As the days passed, James noticed more unusual things about her. She knew details about European politics that most teachers wouldn't know. When the BBC News came on the radio, she listened with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what the political movements meant for the war. She could discuss military strategy in a way that impressed even the resistance fighters. One afternoon, James found her reading a book of poetry in what appeared to be Latin. When she saw him watching, she quickly closed the book and smiled. "Just trying to keep my mind sharp," she said. "Languages fade if you don't practice them. You read Latin?" James asked, impressed despite himself. "A little. My education was thorough." That evening, James was cleaning his rifle when Wilhelmina sat down beside him. She watched his movements with interest, and he noticed she understood exactly what he was doing. Most civilians would be nervous around weapons, but she seemed familiar with them. "You handle that like you've done it 1,000 times," she observed. "Military training," James replied. "Pick things up quickly when your life depends on it." "Yes," she said softly. "I imagine you do." There was something in her voice that made James look up. For a moment, their eyes met, and he felt a connection that went beyond their shared experience in the village. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a depth to her, a strength that drew him in. "James," she said, and the way she said his name made his heart beat faster. "When this war is over, what will you do?" "Go back to England, I suppose. Try to build a normal life again." What about you? Wilhelmina was quiet for a long moment. Not sure normal is possible for any of us after what we've seen. We'll all be changed by this. The next morning, James received word that his target was ready. The German supply depot was lightly guarded, and the resistance had mapped out the perfect approach. It was time to complete his mission as he prepared. His equipment, Wilhelmina watched from the doorway. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. I have a job to finish, James replied, checking his explosives one last time. But you'll be safe here until you can travel south. She walked over to him and, without warning, placed her hand on his arm. Be careful, James. The world needs good men like you to survive this war. There was something in the way she said it, something that suggested she understood more about the world and the war than she had let on. James found himself wanting to ask her more questions, to understand who she really was beneath the story of being a simple teacher. But time was running out. The mission couldn't wait any longer. When I come back, he said, surprising himself with his boldness. Maybe we could talk more about what happens after the war. Wilhelmina smiled, and for the first time since he had pulled her from the rubble, she looked truly happy. I would like that very much. As James left the safe house that morning, heading toward what could be his final mission, he carried with him the image of her smile and the growing certainty that there was much more to Wilhelmina than met the eye. London, 2 years after the war had ended, was slowly coming back to life. The bombs had stopped falling, but the scars remained visible everywhere. James Mitchell walked through the city streets, now working as a journalist for the London Herald. His war experiences had taught him to see stories where others saw only ordinary events. The assignment seemed routine enough: cover a diplomatic reception celebrating the restoration of European monarchies. Kings and queens, who had fled during the war, were returning to their thrones, and London was hosting a grand celebration to welcome them back. James adjusted his tie as he approached the elegant hotel where the event was being held. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over men in expensive suits and women in beautiful gowns. Diplomats from across Europe mingled with British officials discussing the future of their war-torn continent. James moved through the crowd with his notebook, interviewing various guests about their hopes for peace. He was talking to a French ambassador when the announcer's voice cut through the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, Her Royal Highness, Princess Isabella of the Netherlands. James looked up casually, expecting to see another royal face he didn't recognize. But as the woman entered the ballroom, his notebook slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. There, wearing an elegant blue dress and a small diamond tiara, was Wilhelmina. The woman he had carried through gunfire in a Dutch village was now gliding across the ballroom, wore with the grace of someone born to royalty. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, her posture regal, and she moved with a confidence that came from years of training. But her eyes, those same intelligent dark eyes, were unmistakable. James stood frozen as she made her way around the room, greeting other guests with practiced diplomatic smiles. She spoke effortlessly in French to the ambassador beside him, then switched to German with a visiting minister, her accent perfect in both languages. This was not the frightened teacher from Amsterdam. This was a princess. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for just a moment, Princess Isabella's composed expression faltered. She recognized him immediately, but quickly recovered her diplomatic smile and continued her conversation with a British lord. James spent the rest of the evening watching her from a distance, his mind racing with questions. Everything made sense. Now her perfect teeth, her soft hands, her knowledge of politics and languages, the way she had remained calm under pressure. She hadn't been a teacher at all. She was royalty. As the evening wound down, James was packing up his notes when a gentle voice spoke behind him. Mr. Mitchell, isn't it? I believe we met during the war. He turned to find Princess Isabella standing there, having somehow slipped away from her diplomatic handlers. Up close, she was even more beautiful than he remembered, but there was something sad in her eyes. Your Highness, James said, not sure whether he should bow or shake her hand. I had no idea who you were, and I couldn't tell you, she replied quietly. Walk with me to the garden, can speak more freely there. They stepped out onto a stone terrace overlooking a small garden. The November air was cold, but Isabella seemed not to notice. For a few moments they stood in silence, both lost in memories of that night in Holland. "My name really is Wilhelmina," she said finally. "Wilhelmina Isabella van Nassau. My friends call me Isabella. I wasn't lying about everything, but you were never a teacher." She shook her head. "I was studying languages at university when the war started. My family thought it would be safer if people believed I was dead. There had been threats, assassination, attempts, so they arranged for me to disappear." James felt a mix of emotions, betrayal, understanding, and something deeper that he didn't want to admit. "So when I found you in that church, I was running for my life. Nazi collaborators had discovered I was still alive and were hunting me. If you hadn't found me that night, they would have killed me before morning." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You saved the life of someone you thought was a stranger. That says everything about who you are. You let me believe you were just a village teacher. I had to. Even in the safe house, there could have been informants. The fewer people who knew the truth, the safer everyone was." She turned to face him fully. "But I never lied about how I felt." James remembered their conversations by the fireplace, the way she had looked at him before he left for his mission. "What happened after I left the safe house? The resistance moved me to another location, then another. I spent the rest of the war hidden in different places, always moving, always afraid. When the war ended, I had to become Princess Isabella. Again. But part of me never stopped being the woman you rescued from the rubble." A diplomatic aide appeared at the garden entrance, clearly looking for the princess. Isabella saw him and sighed. "I have to go. There are more people to meet, more hands to shake." "Will I see you again?" James asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. Isabella looked at him with those eyes that had haunted his dreams for 2 years. "I hope so, but you should know my life is not my own anymore. I have duties, responsibilities. My family expects me to marry someone who can strengthen our political alliances." "I understand," James said, though his heart was breaking. "You're a princess. I'm just a journalist. You're the man who saved my life without asking for anything." In return, she corrected him. "That makes you more noble than most of the princes I've met." The aide coughed politely, and Isabella knew she couldn't delay any longer. "Goodbye, James. Thank you for everything." As she walked back into the ballroom, James remained in the garden, watching her disappear into her royal world. The woman he had fallen in love with during the war was real, but she belonged to a life he could never be part of. Inside. Princess Isabella smiled and nodded at the important people who surrounded her. But her thoughts remained with the man in the garden, who had shown her what true courage looked like. The Netherlands, spring 1947. The country was still rebuilding from the war. But hope filled the air as people worked to restore their homeland. James had been assigned to cover the Dutch royal family for several months now, documenting their efforts to reconnect with their people after years of exile during the occupation. He tried to keep his distance from Princess Isabella, but their paths crossed often during official events. Each time he saw her, his heart ached with memories of their time together during the war. She was always surrounded by advisors, diplomats, and other royals, playing her part perfectly as a princess should. Then came the news that changed everything. Prince William, the heir to the Dutch throne, was killed in a car accident while driving through the countryside. The entire nation mourned, and suddenly Princess Isabella found herself next in line to become queen. At just 29 years old, she would soon carry the weight of an entire country on her shoulders. James was at the royal palace covering the official announcement when he saw her for the first time since the accident. Isabella stood with the royal family as they met with government officials, but he could see the strain in her face. The carefree woman he had once known was gone, replaced by someone who looked tired and overwhelmed. After the formal ceremony, James was packing his camera equipment when a palace aide approached him quietly. "Miss Isabella requests a private word with you in the East Garden," the aide whispered. "She said you would understand." James followed the aide through marble hallways lined with portraits of Dutch kings and queens from centuries past. Soon, Isabella would join their ranks, whether she wanted to or not. The garden was small and private, hidden behind tall hedges where no one could see them. Isabella was standing by a fountain, still wearing her formal black dress from the ceremony. When she heard his footsteps, she turned around, and James was shocked to see tears in her eyes. "I can't do this, James," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to be queen. I was supposed to be the spare, the one who could live a relatively normal life. William was trained for this from birth. I studied languages and art, not statecraft." James wanted to comfort her, but he wasn't sure if he should. The rules of royal protocol were strict, and they were no longer just two people who had shared a dangerous moment during wartime. She was about to become one of the most powerful people in Europe. "You'll learn," he said gently. "You're stronger than you think. I saw that strength when I pulled you from the rubble." Isabella laughed bitterly. That was different. That was survival. This is about leading millions of people, making decisions that will affect generations. What if I make the wrong choice? What if I fail them? Then you'll learn from your mistakes and do better next time. That's what good leaders do. She walked closer to him, and for a moment, they were just two people in a garden, not a princess and a journalist. "Do you ever think about what might have been different? If we had met in peacetime, if I had really been just a teacher?" James felt his heart skip a beat every day, he admitted. "But we can't change who we are." "Can't we?" Isabella asked. "What if I refused the crown? What if I chose a different life?" "Your people need you," James said, though the words hurt to speak. They've been through so much. They need someone who understands what they've suffered. Someone who was there during the darkest times. You can give them that. Isabella nodded slowly, tears still shining in her eyes. "My advisors are already talking about marriage. They say I need a husband who can strengthen our alliances with other countries. Someone with a title. Someone who understands royal duties." The words hit James like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And what do you want?" "I want what I can never have," she whispered. "I want to choose my own life, my own future. I want to be with someone who sees me as a person, not as a crown to be one." They stood in silence for a long moment, both understanding the impossible situation they faced. James wanted to tell her to run away with him, to abandon everything and start fresh somewhere new, but he knew she would never do it. Of duty was too strong, or something else, Isabella said, her voice becoming stronger. "The coronation is set for next spring. After that, everything will change. I'll have responsibilities that will consume my entire life. If we're going to say goodbye properly, it has to be soon." James felt his world shifting. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that in a few months I'll be Queen Isabella, and I'll have to marry whoever my advisors choose. But right now, I'm still just Isabella, the woman you saved from a bombed church. And I want to spend whatever time we have left being honest about how we feel." The proposal was dangerous and could destroy both their lives if discovered. But as James looked into her eyes, he saw the same brave woman who had faced German soldiers. Without flinching, she was offering him a few precious months of happiness before duty claimed her forever. "The risk, ... he started to say. "I've been thinking about risk and reward," Isabella interrupted. "I'm about to spend the rest of my life doing what others expect of me. For once, I want to do what my heart tells me to do." James reached out and took her hand, feeling the softness he remembered from their time in the safe house. "Then we'll find a way. Carefully, secretly. But we'll find a way." As the sun set over the palace gardens, they made plans to meet again, knowing that every moment together brought them closer to an inevitable goodbye. Amsterdam, May 15th, 1948. The entire city sparkled under the spring sunshine as thousands of people lined the streets. For the coronation of Queen Isabella II, flags hung from every window, and the sound of church bells filled the air. Years of war and suffering, the Dutch people finally had something to celebrate. James stood with the International Press Corps outside the magnificent cathedral, adjusting his camera and checking his notes one final time. He had covered many important events as a journalist, but nothing had prepared him for the emotions flooding through him today. Somewhere inside that ancient building, the woman he loved was about to become a queen. The past 10 months had been the most wonderful and heartbreaking of his life. He and Isabella had found ways to meet in secret, quiet walks in hidden gardens, brief conversations in empty museum halls, stolen moments in the back rooms of bookshops where no one would recognize her. They had talked about everything and nothing, sharing dreams they both knew could never come true. Isabella had shown him a side of herself that no one else saw, not the princess trained in diplomacy and protocol, but the woman who loved poetry and laughed at silly jokes. She told him about her fears of ruling, her hopes for her country, and her sadness that her life had been decided for her before she was even born. In return, James had shared his own dreams of traveling the world as a writer, of finding stories that mattered and telling them truthfully. They both knew their time together was borrowed. Each meeting brought them closer to the day when she would belong entirely to her country and her crown. The cathedral doors opened, and the coronation procession began. First came the palace guards in their ceremonial uniforms, their boots clicking in perfect rhythm on the stone steps. Then the government ministers, the foreign dignitaries, and finally, the royal family members who had survived the war. James raised his camera as Isabella appeared at the cathedral entrance. She wore a dress of pure white silk that seemed to glow in the sunlight, and the ancient crown jewels of the Netherlands caught the light like captured stars. She looked every inch a queen, but James could see the slight tremor in her hands and knew she was nervous. The ceremony inside the cathedral lasted for 3 hours. James and the other journalists listened to the proceedings through speakers set up outside, hearing the ancient words that would transform Princess Isabella into Queen Isabella. 2. When the Archbishop finally placed the crown on her head and declared her the rightful monarch. The crowd outside erupted in cheers that could probably be heard for miles. After the religious ceremony came the public celebration. The new queen appeared on the palace balcony to wave at her subjects, who had gathered in the square below. James watched through his camera lens as she smiled and waved, playing her part perfectly. But he knew her well enough now to see the loneliness behind her smile. The evening brought a grand reception for foreign diplomats and visiting royalty. James was there as a member of the press, documenting the historic day for his newspaper. He watched as Isabella moved gracefully from group to group, speaking perfect French with the Belgian ambassador, flawless German with visiting ministers, in charming English with the British delegation near midnight. As the formal reception was winding down, James was surprised when a palace aide approached him quietly. "Her Majesty requests a word with you in the blue room," the aide whispered. "Please follow me." The blue room was small and private, decorated with portraits of previous Dutch queens. Isabella was there alone, still wearing her coronation gown, but looking exhausted. The crown had been removed, and her hair fell loosely around her shoulders. "You came," she said softly when she saw him. "I wouldn't have missed your coronation for anything," James replied. "You were magnificent today. Your people love you already." Isabella smiled sadly. "Do they? Or do they just love the idea of having their monarchy restored? Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a character in someone else's story." "You're not a character," James said firmly. "You're a real person who happens to wear a crown. That's what will make you a great queen. You remember what it feels like too. Be human." They stood facing each other across the elegant room, both knowing this would be their final private conversation. Tomorrow, Isabella would begin her duties as queen in earnest, and there would be no more secret meetings or stolen moments. "I have something for you," Isabella said, reaching into a small drawer in an antique desk. She pulled out a simple gold locket on a thin chain. "It's belonged to my grandmother. She told me once that love is the only thing that truly matters in life, even when we can't keep the person we love." James took the locket, feeling its weight in his palm. "Can't accept this. It's too valuable." "It's not valuable because of the gold," Isabella said. "It's valuable because it represents a choice. My grandmother chose love over duty once, many years ago. She gave up her first love to marry for political reasons, but she never forgot him. I want you to have something to remember that what we felt was real." James carefully put the locket in his pocket. "What happens now?" "Now I become the queen my country needs me to be," Isabella said with quiet determination. "My advisors have already suggested several suitable marriage candidates. I'll choose one of them within the year. Someone who can help strengthen our alliances and give the country future heirs." "And will you be happy?" Isabella considered the question seriously. "I'll be useful. I'll be the queen my people deserve. Sometimes that has to be enough." James wanted to protest, to tell her she deserved more than just duty and responsibility. But he understood now that this was her choice, made freely and with full knowledge of what she was sacrificing. "I want you to know," Isabella continued, "that saving me from that church changed my life in ways you'll never fully understand. Not just because you rescued me from the rubble, but because you showed me what it means to act without expecting. Anything in return, that's the kind of queen I want to be." Years later, James would write in his memoirs about the night he carried a future queen to safety, never knowing who she was. He would describe how a single act of courage during wartime had rippled through both their lives, creating a love story that could never have a happy ending, but was beautiful anyway. But on this coronation night, as he said goodbye to the woman who would always be both Princess Isabella and simply Wilhelmina to him, James knew he had been part of something larger than himself. He had saved a queen, and in return, she had shown him what true nobility looked like.